I will now invite Alina Inayeh from the German Marshall Fund of the United States to lead the next session of the Democratic Resilience Track, Protecting Democratic Election from Malign Actors and the Power of Algorithm. Alina, please join us on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for still being here with us. It's not an easy conversation that we are going to have, although the title seems to be extremely specific and clear. We've been trying to dig a little bit into what it is that we want to talk when we were in the green room. And as I said, the conversation could last for 3 hours or could last for the 45 minutes that we were assigned, and we went for the second choice. So we'll keep it as crisp as possible. And I have 4 wonderful speakers with me to help lead the conversation, who are not only extremely knowledgeable, but they are also very, very disciplined when it comes to time. And we'll start a little bit with the very title of the session, which is extremely specific. As I was saying, it refers to elections, it refers to malign interference, and it refers to algorithms. And I will turn to John to help us explain a little bit the title. Malign interference, is it only external? Is it only elections? What do we do about respecting freedom, respecting democracy, yet still limiting the malign influence, interference?
Thank you, Alina, and thank you to the Warsaw Security Forum. What a pleasure to be here with such a great group. So when I read the title, I found myself thinking, what's the problem we want to look at here? Because when framed in that way, and sometimes I feel like the discussion looks to me like it's a concern about the weeks leading up to an election in which social media platforms are used, usually to confuse voters. But I feel like we know now at this point, this began probably in 2014, frankly here in Ukraine. 2016, we know this is part of a much broader effort of global authoritarian malign influence. It's not just algorithms. I'd like to talk about algorithms, but it's also about media content sharing arrangements all around the country, all around the world. It's also about the use of oligarchs and kleptocratic resources that are being stored in democratic financial institutions and used to exert influence on political elections in Europe, in the United States, but then again also in places like Brazil, in the Philippines, where we see these issues coming. So I think we have to recognize that the algorithms piece is one toolkit, and I'll leave you with one data point, and I'll turn you there, that really struck me. Some of the folks I think who do some of the best work is Graphika. And Graphika has a report about the 2016 US election that shows, indeed, in the weeks leading up to the election, there were some 6 million bots, fake news, conspiracy theory links. 4 months later, there were nearly 5 million still. This is a much broader pattern. And I'll stop there because I do want to get into algorithms, but I don't want us to lose sight of the bigger problem of sort of malign influence upon democratic elections. Of course, it's a problem at home. The research shows that indeed, much of this information comes from domestic sources as well. But I think that we really have to sort of situate it broader, or it's really easy to get lost in a kind of technological discussion that misses, I think, the issues of the democracy dimensions that we should be talking about.
So if we are talking about algorithms, maybe I should turn to Marcin and ask you, are algorithms enough to safeguard freedom of speech, but also to limit malign influences? And are they usable? Is there anything else we should be using, people should be using, or who should be using behind and besides algorithms?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I would just very shortly just like to quote John, that algorithms are just one element of the whole puzzle. But of course, they can be helpful or harmful, like anything. They are a tool. So definitely there's work to be done to improve the way algorithms, which, you know, we know that they are a huge part of our online experience, with the amount of content, especially user-generated content, that is basically being produced every day. Without algorithms, we would be swimming in a completely chaotic sea and the internet would be unusable. So yes, algorithms play a role, and they can be improved, and we have done this over the years. We just spoke before the panel that a lot has been changing, especially since, let's say, 10 years ago. And one of these things that we've been doing is moving away from an algorithm. I'm talking very generally here, moving away from an algorithm that is a pure representation of what's out there and what people are looking at, for example, which was the way it was initially, to one that is heavily taking into account the quality of information, and the reliability of the source where it comes from. So a lot more is being placed on who is talking, in terms of both quality, and these are, of course, mostly traditional, and in large part, traditional media organizations, but also the transparency angle, so you can see who is talking. And if you look at the trust project we're running with some media organization, that is an important element. So we both, we know who's talking, and these people are identified, and the algorithm surfaces these sources that are verified and quality and helpful, and not just popular. So there is definitely a lot to be done, and there is work being done, but that's definitely not going to just solve the problem in itself, especially depending on the kind of social media. Sometimes the users have a very heavy influence on what is being shared, and no algorithm will help you if the people really want to share this kind of content.
Let's be a little more specific and talk about elections coming up in November. The midterm elections coming up in the States, elections that we just recently held in Italy and in other parts of Europe, but focusing a little bit on the US. Carl, do you think that both Russia and China, let's be even more specific now, will succeed in having an interference in the upcoming elections? And is there any way that through the social media, or the social media should be disciplined in order to minimize this influence?
Yeah, I think the answer to the direct question is, of course. I mean, we've seen the evidence of this previously in previous elections, and it's not just the US, it's all over Europe. I take exactly what John was saying, which is this is just one tool in the toolbox for malign influence and for the destabilization of democratic regimes. But I think we have to ask ourselves, why is this the tool of choice for a lot of these authoritarian regimes? Why do they invest so much in it? I mean, take a country like Bulgaria, which has just had elections recently, and in Bulgaria, we know that there are strong links with Russia. There have been offline Russian influence operations around pipelines for many, many years, decades now, for example. These are the kind of classic subversion techniques, I would say, influence techniques. But also the Kremlin invests something like 200 to 300 billion per year on Facebook advertising in Bulgaria. And you can tell the effects of that right now. Bulgaria has had, effectively, its oil and gas supplies cut off unilaterally by Gazprom and the Kremlin. And yet the amount of support online for Russia expressed by the Bulgarian population is amazing. It's particularly important because 70% of the Bulgarian population get their news from Facebook. Yeah, and I think this is why there is a specific responsibility for these platforms, because they are now the town hall. They are the agora for these public debates, not just in countries where, say, Facebook is the internet, like Myanmar or large parts of Africa, but even in a country like Bulgaria. So I think there's specific responsibilities. We have to look at why it's so attractive to authoritarian regimes, and I think a lot of that is around the business model, around the micro-targeting that these platforms use. This is a holy grail to anybody who's involved in political influence campaign, that you can create a kind of digital clone, a model of somebody, a model that people aren't even aware of, and you can influence aspects of their choice and behavior in ways that they are only dimly aware of and aren't labeled as political advertising. You know, for dark ops, for political influence, this is amazing. And I think so we need to, there's a lot we can talk about transparency of algorithms and so forth, that's downstream. I think we also need to look upstream at the way that these platforms collect data, make these models using data that we haven't given them. It's often inferred data, and then they essentially sell that to the highest bidder.
So again, in order to minimize the influence through the social media, through the platforms, what should be the rules? Brussels is trying to put out some rules in order to discipline this a little bit. Are these efforts so far enough? Are these rules enough? Should there be something else, Nad'a?
I think it's a process, and because the technology, the internet evolves, we will have to think of the further ways to address the rising challenges that come with the use of algorithms, with the maybe the reasons why authoritarian regimes are trying to influence, manipulate information in the public sphere. So I think that the constant process of improvement, of addressing these threats in a relevant, meaningful, and timely manner will continue to be the case. So what has been done so far, for me, it's just part of this process. We see the adoption of the Digital Services Act, Markets Act, the updated Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is not a directive, it's not it's more of a kind of self-regulatory for the companies, but we do have now more companies, we do have more platforms, we have more actors signing the code, and that is kind of sharing the responsibility and making sure that the wider ecosystem is involved in addressing these challenges. So what Brussels does, we also have to come back, it's what the member states also make it possible for Brussels to legislate on in many ways. So it's also in the interest of the democracies of the member states that do show that they do care and that they acknowledge that these are rising challenges that must be addressed to defend democracy or ensure the protection of the democratic values, the rights of freedoms of expression and gatherings, etc. But what more could be done, I think, is actually on this front of what has been mentioned a little bit on the front of transparency and accountability. The fact that we do not have, or certain companies, social media platforms, giants, are still restricting the access to the algorithms, to the ways of how the ecosystem works, how are these messages spread, how are they financed, the financing of this, what is allowed, the scale, the magnitude, the frequency of all of this matters in order to make the right regulations to engage in this debate in really tailored way. So we don't kind of swim in the pool of the quantity of information trying to find the right way, but we actually do have more of a coordinated, cooperative, and therefore more effective way to counter the spread of this information. So I do think there is definitely much more to do, not only by Brussels, definitely by democracies themselves, but beyond that, it's not only, I think, the responsibility of the states. We need to engage the wider stakeholders groups like the civil society, academia, the media companies. I mean, the whole fact that it's also the media companies that sometimes share this information that come from the social media platforms. It's a circular kind of system, and we need to engage more actors, advertising companies, marketing companies, as you said, personalities, influencers, also individual private people. We see it now, maybe we'll discuss further as well, have now rising power in the public sphere. So we need to also consider that there are more actors that need to play a role, and therefore this ecosystem is something that we need to engage those actors as well.
I mean, I'd like to echo that point very, very strongly about bringing more people into the investigation of these algorithms, right? I mean, there's a proposal on the table from the European Commission that would give regulators access, but I think there has to be access for independent academics, civil society for this data as well, because again, this is just about applying standards that are in other sectors to these big platforms. For example, there has long been the principle that if your product creates safety risks, it needs to be independently inspected and verified. And I think we're just asking that in this case, where there are risks to our democracy, to some of the most precious things that we have, that these things can be independently verified. And one example of that is, for example, we all feel the effects of the kind of content moderation algorithms in our Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds. Why don't we know exactly how these work, and there should be more interoperability. We should be able to choose between different content moderation systems. The sort of resistance of companies to these kind of, I think, very simple measures is a little incomprehensible.
Thank you. If I can, I'd love to build on some of these points. To me, it seems that there are two dimensions to this challenge that we should and can identify. I mean, the first is really sort of the defensive agenda, countering malign influence from outside on our countries. And on this, I would certainly think very clearly that it's not that engaging civil society is important, because in fact, it is civil society that is often the organizations that are out there identifying, advocating, raising, and speaking up on these issues. It's independent journalists, in some places, in some very risky places who merit our support and our protection. But the other, if we're just playing defense, it's not going to get us anywhere. The question is, how can we have a proactive agenda that advances the democratic principles, the principles of transparency, of accountability? And how can we recognize that there was Ron Diebert of Citizen Lab in Toronto has written some really compelling work that warns that even that basic business model that you talked about is one that is in many ways more aligned with authoritarian values. Their values, it's about monitoring, surveillance, and manipulation. But how do we respond to that in a way that is true to the democratic values that, frankly, I think are going to be the key to the democratic success? How do we recognize what is the relationship with the private sector, which will remain the private sector? And how do we then come up with a process as well that engages really our strengths of these kind of bottom-up approaches that authoritarian regimes lack? Is where vibrant civil societies that can play that role and advocate and respond both sides of this agenda.
There always is this tension between democracy and the extent of freedom of speech, and the fear of encroaching about this freedom of speech when you come up with any sort of regulation, any sort of censorship, even self-censorship to a certain extent. It's obviously much easier in countries like China and Russia, where they just cut off the internet, hence there is no problem. We cannot do this. We are democratic. We operate in democratic societies. So, however you look at this question always comes up to my, to my mind, and to a lot of people's mind. Isn't this, stepping it into my own personal liberties and freedom? So again, coming back now to the company part of it, or to the company perspective on this, are there ways that the companies, that big platforms can behave differently, still ensuring freedom of speech, yet still limiting interference, malign interference? Well, interference.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest question. And one that is a bit of both a thin line to walk and also a bit of a moving line to hit. And we've been talking about how these policies have changed over time already. I'd just like to quickly touch upon what Carl and Nad'a said. Some of these, I completely agree with the way you propose we move, and a lot of this stuff, at least I cannot speak for all the platforms, but if you look at what we're doing, transparency, you have the electoral ads transparency register, where you can see the ad, you can see who paid for it, you can see how many times it was viewed, you can see how it was targeted, and the targeting has been very limited. For electoral, for political issues, you can only target by general location, age and gender. So it's very limited. There's no way of micro-targeting people by, especially sensitive data. So a lot of this stuff has already been done. At least, like I said, I cannot speak for any other platform, but at least as far as Google goes, I completely agree with what you said, and I think we are mostly there. We are signatories of the code you mentioned on disinformation and many other things, and there is the regulation on political advertising also coming, which to a large extent, I think we're already compliant even before it's been enacted. But the question you're saying is actually quite pertinent to this regulation as well, because one of the biggest issues is that how do you define a political speech? Like, what issues are political? Because once we start regulating this part, like, where is the line? What issues are to be considered? Is environment political? You could argue it is, right? Is science political? Science has become political in recent years, to my surprise. So I think the balance between freedom of speech and we said before the panel, no medium is completely transparent. So there's always some sort of noise introduced into the system by the medium that's being used. But we do have to I do see personally that there is sometimes voices that go a little bit too far. People claim something to be disinformation just because it disagrees with their worldview, right? So there is a very difficult, and we as platforms, we as the medium must be super careful about this. I mean, this is a great responsibility. Of course, we have a responsibility to protect democracy, as Carl said, as corporate citizens. I think no one is denying that. But on the other hand, the freedom of speech angle is also very important, especially us coming from the US with First Amendment, and we're very, very attached to the whole openness of the internet and of our platforms, which is generally a massive, I think, a great boon to society. So in keeping the core of freedom of speech, we do have to try and limit as much as we can, of course, acknowledging that we can never eradicate everything, but through transparency, through responsible policies, and through cooperation, like was just mentioned ago, I think we can at least limit. We have some metrics like that on YouTube, the views from infringing content should not be more than 0.5%. Right? So we should have realistic goals, and I think we can definitely make good progress, but try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater as well.
Some may argue, and I tend to agree with them, that we can have the most perfect regulations, and we can have the most understanding and disciplined and well-intended, platforms. Yet, as long as there is something missing, this will not work. And that's something, we talked a little bit about this earlier, Marcin, in the room, and that something is education, personal education, the way each one of us approach the platforms, use the platforms, the way each one of us are able or not able, or willing or not willing to discern information and fake information. And I'm coming to you, Nad'a, from where you sit in Brussels, from what you're looking at European Commission and everything that's being done in the direction of limiting malign interference. Do you think there is enough effort being put on education as well?
I think there is actually a lot of effort put to media literacy, digital literacy. There is a rising awareness building whole system and investments into this across different member states. There is a media literacy day or few days per year. I think the Commission has been in lead of that. Civil society as well has been increasing the number of the trainings. I think education will and always is useful to enhance, to counter, or be able to be resilient to disinformation. But one of the main issues is that it's not that sometimes people don't understand or don't recognize something being manipulated or being it falsehood or just disinformation to a certain extent. They will still spread it further because it does somehow support their beliefs, or they want to have this message out for whatever reason. So the education is only part of the puzzle to solve this. And I think coming back on the idea of like the political communication and how like what role is science now, political and every other domain. The idea is not necessarily focusing so much on the content, because we do have freedom of speech, opinions. People will be finding a way of sharing their views. It's more about the reach and the speed and the scale of spreading those messages, which are not only happening in the social media space, it's also through emails and other tools and applications. So I think some of you, and this is a very valid point, it's not only about freedom of speech, but also is it about freedom of reach? Is the freedom of reach deserving the same rights as freedom of speech? And then we also have heard several times Commissioner Věra Jourová, who has also stated that the rules that apply offline should also apply online. So why should we have different rules for these spaces? I mean, we can debate how to address those things, but there is absolutely the role of education, putting also the responsibility on the consumers, on the citizens, let's say the users of the social media platforms, but let's be realistic here and see who has the real accountability and the real power to adjust these kind of behavioral patterns, the algorithms, but also the other ways of amplifications of those narratives. And here we have the other major actors, such as social media companies, such as the state regulators, such as the advertising companies, marketing companies. So it's also about how to protect the people's private data, because a lot of this information that is being then used further, sold, as you mentioned, to the companies, is actually like to marketing companies that have the phone numbers. We saw it in 2018 elections in Brazil. They were so-called WhatsApp elections. And why were there WhatsApp elections? Because there were thousands of messages which were able to be spread to huge groups of WhatsApp consumers. These are encrypted messages, so it's very difficult to also expose, to kind of intervene into this process. And the data, the phone numbers that were gathered by the companies were received and purchased from other companies that had access to it. So afterwards, one of the measures was to actually not allow this type of selling and purchases of the private information. There has been limit put on the number of the groups and the messages that you can spread in one go across WhatsApp or other applications. So there have been measures since, but we have seen that even in the elections last weekend. Of course, there was a lot of reference in Brazil to the previous elections 4 years ago, the WhatsApp elections. I mean, some things changed, many of things stay the same, because you have seen only certain restrictions being implemented. So we also speak about this kind of encrypted, more closed groups, which are extremely used for also the spread of this information. So how do we address those?
I want to take the conversation a little bit further, because we've been talking about malign interference, we've been talking about disinformation, but there is another, it's not only another term that is being used, but there is another reality which is being inflicted upon us, which is psychological warfare. We are beyond disinformation, we are beyond fake news, we are, well, even beyond malign interference. We are in the middle of a psychological warfare. And I'm coming back to what you said earlier, Glenn, that, John, sorry, that it's not enough to be defensive. So what do you mean by that? How can it be offensive? How can it be offensive when we are in the middle of, or the victims of psychological war?
So it's a really important point here. And I actually think it brings us to one of the conversations we've been having throughout these 2 days, which is Ukraine. Alongside Russia's unprovoked military invasion, it has been using the tools of information warfare alongside it. And what's been really interesting is it's not hard to read folks saying that Ukraine seems to be winning the information war, actually. And it's because they've had 8 years since 2014 to be learning the lessons. Suddenly these new phrases that we hear about pre-buttles, this effort of civil society groups to cooperate happened so quickly. But I tell you, the reason I think it's important, and the reason I pulled my notes out here, is because in this early era, when we're talking in some ways around issues around science, it can sound like, and the response is about fact-checking. Is it true something is not true? But when we get in this situation, it's different. And I want to just quote one sentence here, but I was struck last week listening to Tim Snyder talk about the referenda that were being sham referenda in the republics of Ukraine there, and he said, the way Russian electoral propaganda works is to tell a lie that everyone knows is a lie, and then to show by force that there is no alternative to living as though the lie were true. And I think this is when we get in the sort of incredibly difficult moment in which it's not just enough to say, oh, we'll just show that that's not true. We'll just fact check it. We'll just teach people to recognize falsehoods. And that's why I think there, and I actually think though that in Ukraine, it's difficult in some ways to say far, this conflict isn't over, but we're seeing an acceleration of learning in the information space that I think we have a lot to learn from.
Carl, your organization, the organization you represent, works in a lot of difficult societies, I would say. How do you, first of all, how do you deal with everything, with the psychological warfare, with informational warfare in these societies? How do you help societies deal with this informational warfare? And what do you think would be, if there would be one is there a golden bullet that could solve, silver bullet that could solve the problems of all these societies when it comes to informational warfare? We know exactly who the actors are, so it's, at least that it's easy.
Well, indeed, we are very active in lots of challenging environments, as I think the euphemism goes, and I think we've been in the business long enough to know that there are no silver bullets when it comes to questions like promotion of democracy and human rights, right? But what I will say is that the situation is very different in, I would say, mature democracies than it is in some of the most vulnerable regions in the world. What I said before is that for some regions, we saw it in the Rohingya massacre in Myanmar, Facebook, Meta, is the internet. This is, how people access the internet, right? And so, and it's even worse than that because there are understandable pressures on companies like Meta in their home jurisdictions like the US to clean up their act ahead of the midterm elections and the presidential elections. But they don't really invest the same in other, they invest very aggressively in these regions in terms of their business, but they don't invest the same in terms of the kind of basic safeguards you would expect. So one very critical fact here, right, is that even though only 9% of Meta's users speak English, 90% of their investments in content moderation are in the English language, right? So if you then look at what's been happening in India, for example, where exactly this kind of psychological warfare takes place, are psychological influence techniques, I would say, because let's go back to the original business model. You're building a psychological profile of somebody, and you are trying to not deal in arguments, but you're trying to manipulate their emotional reactions. And there aren't even very basic standards of transparency around this. I realize that some platforms have gone to greater lengths than others in this respect. But again, just to take another example from a recent US election, there were lots of videos going around, viral videos going around, supposedly showing France or the Netherlands under Sharia law, pictures of the Mona Lisa in a burqa, for example. Now, these weren't labeled as political content, but they were targeted at people whose fears were about migration, and they were intended to support the candidate who was going to purportedly do something about Muslim migration to the US, right? Now, we only know that this was actually paid for by a super PAC by the Trump campaign at the time because of a mistake in the accounting firm who actually accidentally released this detail into the public domain, right? So this is so far from basic standards of transparency that apply offline. We really need to up our game on this, and I think this is absolutely critical. And I think some of the things that are being done in Brussels now in political advertising transparency will help, but I think there needs to be a lot more done.
We have about 3 minutes before we lose one of the speakers. So if there is a question, or if there are 2 questions from the room, we could take them. And I cannot see anything. Yes, good. Yeah, the gentleman in the 3rd row, and then the lady over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Bissinger. I'm a volunteer at the forum, and I was wondering especially what social media platforms were doing in the sense of content moderation when it comes to outsourcing those tasks to third countries, and especially in link to human rights and working conditions. Thank you.
And that's a question directed to...
It can be to the panel
Marcin.
at a whole, but mainly addressed. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I can again speak for the whole industry. We have, I think, about 20,000 content moderators all around the world, and I do know generally that they are really spread out all across the world, and we're asking about conditions, and they have a uniform set of working conditions and standards, etc. So, the question was quite general, but from our perspective, of course it's a tough job, and we are aware of that, and they get the whole package of support and psychological help and all the safeguards against overexposure and that kind of stuff, including machine learning that helps limit the number of actual human interactions they need to have with really brutal, extreme content. So we are, of course, looking into constantly improving their welfare. So thank you for the question, but I don't know if such a general answer satisfies you, but I'd just like to quickly touch upon some of the themes that were just mentioned, including education. And I think this is something that we really learn to understand, that this is something we need to invest, especially if you mentioned, Iliana, psychological warfare. Like, we need to build resilience of societies. That's the bottom line. So through media literacy, through we've launched, I don't know, maybe some of you have seen ads running on all sorts of media about pre-bunking, this new technique of kind of inoculating against common misinformation techniques. So we have one that is dedicated for this region as part of our special commitment. Especially, there was also mention of lower resources for these niche, say, markets. We have also looked into that, and our CEO has committed an extra fund of 10 million to improve this exactly in the region. But this campaign is directed at the situation with Ukrainian refugees in the region. So specifically targeting the kinds of propaganda tropes that we're seeing in the media, to try and debunk it before it actually impacts people. There's hence pre-bunking. And there's going to be another media literacy on YouTube, which is already launched in the US, where it's coming localized all around the world. So definitely education is one of the key elements for raising resilience. So there's the psychological warfare, as mentioned by John. It doesn't have to work to our disadvantage. If we are a resilient society, a well-educated society that can use social media as a tool for good, I think this is the right path. Thank you.
Carl, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'll be very quick, because I know we're out of time. And so basically, in answer to your question, and there's no easy answer, but I think we have to understand that right now, these platforms are essentially the operating systems of our democracies. They're part of the critical infrastructure of our societies in the same way that financial institutions are and the energy infrastructure is, and they need to be heavily regulated in the same way that these sectors are. And it goes beyond the regulation. I think there just needs to be a constant dialogue between these platforms and regulators and civil society about how we manage our democracies. That's the basic responsibility that I'd like to see anyway in the next few years.
We'll take this last question, and then when you answer the question, I will also ask the speakers to make your final remarks so we can wrap this up as close to the deadline as possible. Yes, go ahead.
Van der Merwe, Senior Policy Advisor at Leiden University. You're talking about education, and whenever we're talking about protecting democratic elections, democracy, the focus tends to be on media literacy, digital literacy. I'm wondering whether we're not paying enough attention to teaching the basics of what democracy looks like. What does civil society look like? A lot of the students that I encounter, don't understand the basics of how democracies actually work, separations of power. And then when you see the rise of authoritarianism, they fall victim to some of the misinformation about how a democracy works, what it looks like, and then therefore cannot see people doing undemocratic things. So I'm wondering whether you can comment on whether we're failing on education beyond just media literacy and not updating our curriculums, especially at a younger age, high school level already. Maybe we're catching it too late.
Great question, thank you. I would add history as well to democracy. So who wants to answer first? You all will have to answer, so who answers first? John, you want to pick it up?
Sure. Unquestionably, this question of civics and civic education, but interestingly, I like the way that you phrased it. We said, this is part of our democracy now, so how are we updating our understanding of these pieces? Let me take just a moment to say that part of what's interesting to me here, and what I appreciated the mentions of Brazil, the mentions of other efforts that are being made here, is this is a problem that can often seem eternally new, sort of starstruck by the problem, and we spend a lot of time, as some say, admiring it. I think we're further than that now, and what we're at a period, maybe we're still in trial and error, and we're figuring out what works. But really what's incumbent upon us now, and I think I heard on this panel's discussion today, is how do we identify, let's just call them, not the solution. I understand, it's not tomorrow, we'll fix it. But what are the elements of an effective response in the respective and appropriate situations. And I really feel that that's the element where I'm really interested in this conversation and where it's going, and where I hope the experts here with us will join us in that. Because that's really where we are, in some ways in my mind, is how can we learn together from our experiences to go forward.
Well, just very quickly, I think I'm very sympathetic to the question, because I think the solution to a lot of our issues around disinformation are to create more curious citizens. But that's a generational project, right? That will take 15, 20 years. And the idea that we do nothing in the meantime, or if we do nothing about the way that this disinformation circulates, is obviously inconceivable. So and then I would refer you to my previous answers on that. Yeah.
So we do have civic education. We do have also these other trainings, media trainings, so history, social sciences. So people do learn about how their democratic system works, especially in their own country. And the democratic system is not the same in every single country. Democracy is not a universal thing, meaning the same things across the whole world. But I do agree that, of course, it is important to engage and perhaps enhance this or connect these issues with other existing curricular items, such as critical thinking, also across different classes. But again, I feel like education is only part of the puzzle, and this resilience building is only going to go as far as we can to actually address the challenges and the threats of spreading manipulated information, having access to millions of people by people who have money, or the companies, etc. So I think it's only part of the puzzle, definitely playing an important role. But also I think how we teach democracy matters. It's not only what we teach. It's also that it's not just I have the right to say what I want because I live in a democratic country. No, we are part of the community. We are part of the society. It's not individualistic approach to addressing these threats, like what I as a user am protected or can do. So thinking of also the other values of empathy, of how do we relate one to each other, is also something that should be part of the education, and it seems that the focus is becoming more and more on the individualism than this collective value. So I do think that it's kind of cross-horizontal discussion.
Thank you. And Marcin, very quickly, because you have to run and we all have to run.
I have to run just quickly on that very, very good point. I think you'll see some of that thinking in what we do ahead of elections, where we do special doodles on election day. We post information about how to vote, where to vote, information on candidates and that kind of stuff, exactly trying to promote the ideas of democracy. So I think that definitely is also a very important question. And just to sum up, I think everything's been said, and as John said, we have a puzzle, but let's move beyond the kind of being surprised with the puzzle and to the solving of the puzzle. I think a lot of work, I feel since I've been at Google, a lot of work has been done, and we're moving quite in a good direction, but more education, more collaboration with civil society, even smart regulation. I think they're all elements of this puzzle, but we're moving in the right direction. I'm optimistic.
On this optimistic note, please join me in thanking the wonderful speakers who were very disciplined and very substantive, and thank you for your patience as well.